Hello, welcome to the holiday edition of World Religions. Thanks you all for being patient with me while I was away. I'm here in the comfort of my mother-in-law's house in lovely Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'm very happy to have here as my technical assistant, my lovely niece, Sophia. Sophia, say hi to the nice students.
Hi.
Sophia is particularly excited that I'm talking about radical Islam today because she's wanted to understand the history of radical Islam for a long time. Isn't that true, Sophia?
Yep.
Yeah, good. So let me make a couple things clear. I mean, I think this is important. There's sort of one lecture that I didn't do that I think is necessary to finish up the Islam section. And I think that it's really important to undermine any sense that contemporary Islamic violence, Islamic radicalism, terrorism, and so forth is part and parcel of Islam. That Islam is necessarily a violent religion, and that violence has been part of Islam since the beginning. Those things are definitely not true, and I would say that understanding that what we think of today as Muslim terrorism is a very particular development in a very specific kind of history. So I'll take you through. What I'm going to try to do is give a sort of linear narrative of that history that'll kind of follow your textbook, and I hope trace just a clear line of logic through all of that and take us into the Arab Spring of the last couple of years. Sound good, Sophia?
Yeah.
You psyched?
Yeah, really
Okay,
sick.
good. Oh, it is Thanksgiving. So excuse me. We need some holiday
Decor.
yeah. Okay, so the turkey and I will go from here. So we have talked a lot this semester about pre-modern forms of religion, modern forms of religion, and postmodern forms of religion, and I want you to think of Islamic radicalism as a particularly modern and postmodern kind of creation. And one place you might begin the history of Islamic radicalism is in the 18th century in Saudi Arabia, when a very important Muslim reformer named Abd al-Wahhab, who lived basically through the entire 18th centuries from 1703 to 1792, launched a very rigorous grassroots attempt to purify Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. So you'll remember in the life of Muhammad that one of the things Islam accomplished was an overcoming of the tribal divisions in Islam and a suppression of the polytheism and idolatry that was part of tribal life in Arabia. Well, al-Wahhab wanted to do the same thing in the 18th century. He believed that Arabians had become fractured with tribal rivalry again, that various pagan forms of religious practice had seeped in, and so he attempted this purifying of Islam that would return it to the Quran and the Sunnah alone. And he opposed a set of particular things that we've studied a little bit about. One is Sufism, the Islamic mysticism of much of the Islamic period that involved a kind of feeling of intimate union with God, and he opposed the worship of saints at Sufi shrines in Islam. He thought these were totally un-Islamic. He launched this purification through violent means, and what he wanted was a more austere and puritanical form of Islam. The influence that he's had in Arabia has been great, and so you will often hear the term Wahhabi Islam to talk about these really austere forms of Islam that continue today and are closely linked with radicalism, as is another related school called Salafi Islam. All right? You with us so far, Sophia?
Yeah.
Okay, good. You look riveted.
I was trying to make it not shake.
So that's the 18th century, right? What follows immediately after that, and what is developing through the 18th century, is the appearance of Europeans in the Muslim world, in North Africa and various parts of Asia. And so with colonialism, you have two possible Islamic reactions to the presence of Europeans and their civilizations. One is a kind of emulation, which embraces science and technology, Western forms of government, secularism, and so forth. And another is a rejection of European colonialism that comes to think that Western forms of governance, education, etc., are fundamentally anti-Islamic and must be rejected. So those two reactions persist to this point today in the Muslim world. But one of the important things that they did for our purposes is out of those conversations there emerged a Muslim elite. People that we have seen also in India and elsewhere, people who became enamored of Western forms of government and education, people who themselves, they availed themselves of Western education, they profited from the presence of Europeans, and they came to regard European forms of governance as superior. They embraced science and technology and secular forms of governance. This is called Islamic modernism. Your textbook calls it Islamic modernism. And Islamic modernism was never very successful. It was never very popular. But it did emerge among an elite who, because they were an educated elite, were themselves quite influential, and they became the opponents of much of the Islamic radicalism that came very shortly thereafter. Right? So, as these modernist forms of Islam that embraced science, technology, secularism, etc., as they began to take power in countries and have ruling influence over segments of Muslim societies, there were many revival movements that erupted, and these revival movements would later sort of flower into Muslim fundamentalism. And I'm just going to talk about one revivalist group that's still around today that you hear a lot about, that continues to be very influential. It's just a way of tracing this particular history. And this group is the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood was formed in Egypt in 1928 by a man named Hassan al-Banna, who was a school teacher in Egypt and who believed that Islam was an all-embracing form of life, and it was all-sufficient. It didn't require the sort of insights of the West. And he formed the Muslim Brotherhood to oppose the educated elites who were increasingly running Egypt and taking over. So you'll know from a border passage that later, in the 1950s, there was a later Egyptian ruler named Nasser, who was very much one of these elites, an authoritarian ruler who established his power in Egypt and attempted to force through Western-style development. He helped build the Suez Canal, for example. So the Muslim Brotherhood was this sort of grassroots organization that recruited vigorously and heavily among Muslim youth, male youth in Egypt, and had widespread popular support. It rejected Western capitalism, it rejected Marxism, two forms of modern kinds of economies that they believed were anti-Islamic. And they challenged, so the Muslim Brotherhood challenged in particular, not the West, not Europe, but those rulers who had embraced Western ways, if you will, those regimes who were seeking to develop their societies as the West had done. So one very good example of that kind of governance came in Turkey, when an important leader named Ataturk, who appears in your reading, established modern democracy in Turkey and outlawed such things, such public displays of Islam, for example, as veiling by women, because that was regarded as backward. So the Muslim Brotherhood was eventually outlawed in Egypt because it took an increasingly radical turn, particularly when a man named Sayyid al-Qutb, Q-U-T-B, again, he appears in your reading, you can check him out. He spent some time studying in the United States. He was appalled by what he saw in the United States. He wrote a famous book about his time here, and one passage that's often read in classrooms and so forth is his passage of watching a church dance at a church in, I think, Minnesota or something like that, in which he saw young couples, unmarried couples, embracing in public, and was horrified by what he saw at what was supposed to be a religious event. So he was radicalized by his time in the West, and he came to have this dualistic worldview that believed that there was the camp of God and the camp of Satan, and there was nobody in between. You were with one or the other. And Sayyid Qutb was quite willing to say that violent means of overthrowing authoritarian regimes that embraced Western ways were fully acceptable. So the Muslim Brotherhood was outlawed in Egypt, and it remained outlawed until very recently, until the events of the Arab Spring. Um, so let me just sketch quickly a sort of range of various Muslim societies, countries, so you can see how various countries responded to the presence of West and now globalization and so forth. So on the one hand, you would have a Saudi Arabia, who is a nation that is ruled by Sharia law. It is illegal for women to drive in Saudi Arabia. They cannot emerge in public not wearing a veil, not being covered in some way, for example. That in that society, Wahhabi Islam that I talked about a few minutes ago was very influential. And on the other hand, it's sort of the other end of the spectrum. You would have a country like Turkey, secular democracy, majority Muslim country, 80-some% are Muslim, but a secular society, a member of NATO, a member of the European Union, etc. And then in between, many countries who you can think of as Islamic states that have governance that is powerfully influenced by Islam, but have constitutional democracies and so forth. And these would be like Pakistan and Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. And what's interesting about all these countries is that their borders were drawn by Western powers, and those borders did not correspond to any realities on the ground. And so a lot of the political troubles in those countries have emerged because their boundaries didn't correspond to anything that was indigenously real, that was really part of them. A series of events took place in the second half of the 20th century that really brought us to the crisis point of 2001 and the attacks on the World Trade Center at that point. And I'll just name a few of them to suggest the increasing globalization of the Muslim radical attack on the West. In 1978-79, the Iranian Revolution overthrew a Western-installed government in Iran. Of course, you know Iran is a Shia country, so that was quite different from what we get with Al-Qaeda and later global terrorism, which I'll talk about in a second. In 1967, one of the events that led to a sense of disaffection and disappointment among Muslims was the Arab-Israeli War, which we have talked about before and which I think is probably important for you to recognize that it was out of that, the disappointment and defeat of that war led many Muslim radical groups to emerge and seek some kind of more confrontational posture with the West. Right? You hanging with me, Sophia?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You sure?
Yeah.
You love Islamic radicalism, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay. In 1981, Anwar Sadat in Egypt was assassinated by Muslim radicals. So you know Nasser in Egypt, who was a strong man in Egypt. Sadat was his successor. Sadat's successor was recently overthrown in the Arab Spring, and I'll talk about him in a second. In 1979, the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the Mosque of the Prophet, was seized by radicals who believed that the Saudi government had turned itself over to Western powers, particularly the United States. And in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Soviet Union invaded, and the U.S. helped arm rebel forces in Afghanistan to throw out the Soviets. And these were groups called Mujahideen, who later took those same arms, the guns and the tanks that the U.S. gave them, and began to build the training camps in Afghanistan that later housed Osama bin Laden and led to the attacks on the World Trade Center. In the 1990s, in a number of Muslim countries, you had sweeping into power increasingly radical leaders who had confrontational postures towards the West, and whose role in spreading global terrorism was to shield various terrorist organizations. Afghanistan was very important in that. Somalia, very important in that. And these are countries that housed Osama bin Laden and helped build Al-Qaeda. In 1993, Al-Qaeda-linked groups bombed the World Trade Center for the first time with truck bombs that were in the basement of the World Trade Center in the parking garage. In the later 1990s, there was an attack. In 1998, there were attacks on the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania by Al-Qaeda. Later that year, an attack on a U.S. warship called the USS Cole by Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So Osama bin Laden was building this global terror network, and there are a couple things that I'd like you to note about it. First of all, it's global. So this is the first organization that has this global kind of reach, and it is Sunni. So it is often as vigorously opposed to Sufi Islam or Shia Islam as it is to the West. So it stands for this puritanical forms of Sunni Islam. And there, the difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and, say, Al-Qaeda later on is that whereas the Muslim Brotherhood has a specific agenda to overthrow the leadership in Egypt that was friendly to the United States, Al-Qaeda and its linked organizations are explicitly attacking the West. And so they've bypassed, if you will, the regional leaders who are friendly to the West, and they are attacking the United States directly, the United States and its allies. I'll mention one other group that I should distinguish from Al-Qaeda, and that's the Taliban, about whom you often hear in the news. And what's important to recognize about the Taliban is they also have a merely regional kind of set of objectives. They are not global. What they want is Sharia law in Afghanistan, the tribal areas of Pakistan. So they're not a global terrorist organization, although they do sometimes work with Al-Qaeda. Okay? So we know what happened in 2001 in New York City and outside Washington, D.C. and in the fields of Pennsylvania. We know that in 2003 the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and launched the global war on terror, which continues in many forms today. But I guess one of the latest products of this, about which you should know something, is something called the Arab Spring, which began in the winter, actually, I guess, in January of 2011, in which democratic movements in Muslim states began overthrowing both radicalized forms of Muslim governance, but also secular governments, as in Egypt, where a leader named Mubarak had been in power 30 years, a military strongman who propped up a kind of secular democracy protected by the army, but who had a great deal of grassroots resistance among conservative Muslims like members of the Muslim Brotherhood, who eventually overthrew him, and in elections that followed the arrest of Mubarak, came to power in democratic elections, and then last year in popular protests were thrown out of power when the army reasserted itself. And so we continue to see this clash between developmental forms of secular kinds of governance and conservative Muslims who wish for some kind of Islamic governance, and this clash is certainly ongoing. The conflict is by no means near over, but I hope that gives you some historical scope to all this. All right? Okay, class, thanks very much for sitting through this. Tomorrow, Sophia and I will send you a much briefer oral account of what you need to do for your presentation for next week. In the meantime, I hope you have a happy holiday. Enjoy being with your families and eating, and go Lions. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.